Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and for some time now, sitting up here on top of this Vermibag Mini, has been this empty box. Usually if you look around my systems, you see all my boxes, even the buckets, everything that's got worms running in them has a label on it. This has no label because it's just a pre-built bin with no worms in it. This thing was built almost 11 weeks ago. 76 days. Tomorrow, 77 days would be 11 weeks since this thing was built. It was built in anticipation of the oldest of my bins, which is over on the opposite end of my collection of bins over here. This spot over here, top left, is reserved for the oldest of my systems. This system is a little bit unique from the perspective of just how long it's been in service. It's now 280 days old. Can you imagine that? That's 40 weeks. That's a really, really old system. And it really did resemble all of my other systems throughout the whole composting phase, through the foraging phase, and even into the beginning of the migration phase. But I did notice that it just wasn't performing the same way when it comes to the depopulation of the worms from the finished castings through the migration process. And I'm chalking that up to just trying to start into that process with much, much, much too damp material. Material that the worms are so comfortable being in that they just don't want to leave. So I think the biggest challenge with that has been allowing for the finished castings to dry to the point where the worms do want to voluntarily leave the material on their own. So my hope is that now, 15 days after the last time we checked in here, that we might be able to actually bring that system to an end. I'd really like to get the worms hauled out of there, get them launched into a nice, fresh, new environment, grab the castings, hopefully depopulated of baby worms, and finally call that system done. But I guess we won't really know if that's possible until we get in there. So let's get to work. Now, to show you where that 280-day age came from, I jotted down the specific time periods allotted to the 3 different phases that this system went through so far. And like I said, the amount of time that this system spent in composting and as well as foraging are, pretty average. It's just this crazy 87 days and counting on the migration that really set this system apart. I think I've got sort of a record in my wormery. Was it 14 days or maybe even 13 days of, initiating a migration zone, the side of the bin where you're putting in the fresh bedding and food and everything. And then, 14 days later, finding that the material has been, absolutely, completely depopulated. No matter how hard you look, you find not a worm. But, it's not always apples to apples if you're going to try to compare migrations, because I think the big difference between one of those record-breaking migrations and this is also record-breaking from the perspective that it's the longest I've ever tried to run a migration. But yeah, I mean, it was, I think, with the start of material in the bin that was just so damp, it just seemed almost impossible that the worms would have any reason to get going, So you saw paper was the only thing covering things here, and as I run my hand across the top, it does feel pretty dry. But castings, you go down an inch and you're already in very damp stuff. This stuff is just incredible when it comes to hanging on to its moisture. Maybe I just should have left it completely uncovered. Even 15 days ago when we last checked in here, we did end up, dragging worms out of here. And a number of them were really puny too. I had noticed in the video I had seen and extracted a couple larger sized ones that I spotted, but in the video I was able to actually see little itsy bitsy baby worms moving around in some of the disrupted material that I had just moved aside. But the other thing that I really noticed in the last time, in the video footage from the last time we were in here, was just how nicely the material was finally beginning to break free of itself. Because for the longest time the material would not unclump. It would just remain in these big boulders, just wet, sticky stuff stuck to itself, but it's finally getting to that point. I think last time too, 15 days ago, we were starting to observe how nicely the stuff was finally beginning to crumble. Yeah, that's good. That's really the key, I believe, is having material that flows. Because as soon as you start getting to that point where there's too much moisture, stuff starts to clump together, and it's almost like a snowflake. I think a snowflake starts with a speck of dust. And it's to the speck of dust that all the water molecules in the air start to collect. And then that's how the snowflake starts to form. But that's how I think clumps in the worm bin start to form too, is that it's some sort of a piece of leftover bedding or food or whatever the case may be, and it's to that castings are all sticking and making a big clump. And it's you know, it's stuff that the worms probably really enjoy. As far as the worms go, you know, the more damp the better, always. You know, worms, for them, moisture is tops. So all these little puny baby worms, jeez Louise, they're everywhere. As soon as you start shaking up the material a little bit, they start moving. But they are all over the place in here still. Little itsy bitsy baby worms all over the place. Jeez Louise. I mean, I really do want to get that new tray started. I'd really love for these worms to have a nice new home already. Feels like they've been sort of semi-denied having a nice large bin to roam in. I mean, they can go back into the finished stuff, but there's no food or bedding there. That's why we've been setting up this side of the bin, and we've continued to increase its size every time. It is really nice how this stuff is starting to crumble. Let's just go right all the way to the far edge. Just curious to see how many worms we find out there. I mean, if we do find just as many worms hanging out on the very, very, very far edge as anywhere else, I'm just wondering if it's going to be necessary to just maybe wait a little longer. I guess the other option would be to just haul out as many worms as I can now and then, you know, try to help round up the remaining baby worms in the material. Set up some sort of a bait station or something and give time for the babies to all emerge, because some of these are just so puny. It seems like they couldn't have been around for very long, you know? I was really pretty confident that we'd be able to do this, and I don't know, I feel like I shouldn't tell myself I can't, you know? The only difference would be, instead of now having a pile of castings, I would just go into my collection bucket that I've got over there that I know is castings that have been for the most part depopulated of worms. I would just be putting a lot of baby worms in there, so maybe a little period of baiting or something as this stuff continues to dry. I can maybe try to round up the stragglers, the ones that are still just so small that they're gonna need a little time to be big enough to get rounded up. I don't know. And you know, I think just the length of time that went on here, you know, we were already attracting worms, and we had a collection of worms starting to assemble in our migration feeding zone. But at the same time, we had nice damp castings that a lot of the adults that stayed behind in were completely content to hang out in and mate and leave cocoons in, and who knows when the last mating pair left here and, you know, dropped off a cocoon to be hatched in this stuff. There is a lot to be said for, you know, kind of watching the time frames, and, you know, if you are able to depopulate castings to a high degree where there's a very, very limited number of potential straggler adult worms that could continue the mating process, then that's kind of the time you gotta get the clock started, and, you know, limit yourself to an amount of time when it comes to trying to run nurseries or stuff like this that just cuts itself off before any of the new babies can potentially get big enough to let the whole cycle start over again. So I apologize. A lot of people are probably thinking to themselves, you know, what's with this picking out worms individually? I thought the whole idea here was to let the worms do all the work. And you're absolutely right. It's just that I really thought that this material would be a little bit drier by now, and also I had anticipated that it would be a little bit further depopulated by now. And, you know, quite honestly, I also felt like we would have much larger babies, you know, not such tiny ones that look like they just emerged on the scene, you know. I really thought that we'd be a little bit further along here. But like I said, there's that potential that there's ones that are still not even hatched. There's still cocoons in here that are just left behind, because it is still quite damp and comfortable. And luckily, for the most part, all we've seen are little babies, maybe one or two decent sized ones. Well, once again, once I try to start making a claim, that's usually when something happens that contradicts me. So yeah, we've definitely got worms that still need to shove out of here. So I don't know, do you agree? Do you disagree? What do we do? It's probably a good idea to just let this process continue if we're really interested in collecting up the maximum number of baby worms. I've got enough castings, so I'm certainly not under any pressure to free up these castings from this worm population to make it available to plants. I've got plenty. And there's just a certain degree of novelty too to this particular population of worms too, because this is the only population that I could really track back to my original worms that I was originally given in the way, in the very beginning. I did have a huge die-off, and then these worms were sort of limped back from oblivion, and their population, their numbers, everything was sort of brought back to a pretty decent normal level. And then we kind of dropped the alarm, and we lowered the severity level that these little guys were dealing with in terms of the potential wipeout of every last worm that could be tracked back to my original population. Ah, boy, what to do. You know what? We're going to do both. We're going to have our cake and we're going to eat it too. I do want to get these worms that have all collected in the feeding area into their new home, and then we'll just give this stuff a little bit more time to dry, and then we'll have more room in which to spread the material out to give it time to dry and space to dry. And I think once the stuff gets to a slightly drier level, we'll have, somewhat better results. So, here's an example of a cocoon that's fairly dark in color, one that you would, probably expect to see worms crawling out of soon, based on its darkness. The really light colored ones are the ones that were just left in the material, and, as they get closer and closer to that point in time when they're going to hatch, that's when they get darker and darker in color. Oh, brother. Tricky system. There's going to be an edge over here where there's going to be lots of babies in the finished castings, but it probably would be good to sort of distinguish which stuff is going to be left behind, just to, try to round up straggler baby worms that might still need to emerge. It ain't going to be much. All the rest, I suppose, we'll just relocate it with the worms, because it's not just extracting worms anymore. This has pretty much been a new worm environment, a new worm, I don't know, how do you say it, To me, it's almost like when that new bin gets a new label, gets a new line on my spreadsheet, it's like a new project starting, But just by the nature of how this migration was arranged and conducted, it sort of transformed from being just your typical migration to almost being the establishment of a new environment in place. And I think that's kind of why I started coming up with these sort of ways to label it or name it, which included the concept of it being an in-place sort of migration or, new system setup. But then I started to realize it really did resemble stuff other people were doing that they were referring to as wedge. So I think I started to really consider this to be more as an example of just another implementation of sort of a design, a wedge, where it is intended that this side will just be the new feeding area continuously, always shoving the oldest stuff over to the point where the oldest stuff would almost be guaranteed to be worm-free and could just be scooped out and harvested. But I think that kind of wedge concept works a little bit better in somewhat larger systems. This is definitely, it kind of had the deck stacked against it trying to run a wedge in such a small space, but it was representative of how it would normally work in a larger system, I believe. All right. I think we've just been spending a little bit too much time here chit-chatting. It just seems like I'm taking so much material if all this goes with the wormies. but I think that's kind of what I had intended. I didn't want to go through the, you know, separation of the worms from the stuff that's with them in the horizontal migration feeding zone. To me, that was already always part of the next system, if you will, just to be hauled out and brought over with the worms when they're relocated. And that's why it's like the 14 feedings that went into making the original batch of castings versus the 8 feedings that have been applied now to this side to prompt the movement of the worms. It's almost like, well, I don't know. To me, it doesn't seem like it's all the same. To me, it does seem like, you know, the 8 feedings over here are maybe giving the new system credit for 18 feedings worth of castings already being present here. And then not claiming that this is 20 some odd feedings worth of castings. This is really just that 14 feedings worth of castings that were fed prior to the migration, even prior to the foraging. It almost feels like we should just bring over the new system and just pour this all into the into the new bin. Let them get situated in their new home. It'll make it almost impossible for us to quantify how many worms we've got in it. I mean, we could pour through it a little bit and pick through it a little bit, but they're going to just dive and they're going to head down into that new material, and we'll catch a glimpse of some of them, but certainly not all of them. But whatever. I think it's time to just do it, don't you? Then we'll throw a piece of melon in here. Maybe we'll round up a few more worms, give it another month. I don't know. Maybe I'll throw this in a smaller container because it doesn't seem like we need this much space for this either. So let's just do it. I'm going to go get that other box that we can pour all of this into, and then we're going to get pretty close to being full over there. That's what you get from deviating from your standard procedures. So let's get this underway. All right. Step aside. In comes the new environment. And it just seems like such a weird way to launch a bin, just dumping in all this stuff, especially all of this nice finished castings material that surrounds them. Oh boy. Ooh, that scared me. Felt like I was about to send the whole thing flying to the ground. And geez, I am really nervous about this because it is heavy. And I don't want to let go until I know it's stable. Let's try this. So it's going to take me a number of handfuls to scoop this stuff out of here. Here's the coffee filter that was serving as feeding zone indicator. Right now we don't have a feeding zone. This is just bedding, but I think they'll be happy in it for now. And they're going to be bought over with, I'm sure, a bunch of leftovers that were probably still residual in here from the previous feeding. Although, I don't know, 15 days ago I think what was fed was a couple of cucumbers. So that's probably something we're not going to see any leftovers of. So, all right, you know what? Let's just do what we can to make this quick and painless as possible. Just go scoop, scoop, scoop. That's kind of the reason I put it up right here on the edge, so I don't have to lift. I could just empty in a way. Let's just start spreading it out. You can see worms throughout the material. We're definitely bringing over lots of residual bedding that they were occupying here. Oops, making a little mess here. Probably not a whole lot of leftover food. But I think, you know, all this fresh bedding that they're being moved into should be seen by them as a bounty of new food. Because after all, that's what it is. This stuff's had plenty of time to sit around and become kind of nice and aged and primed for worm consumption. It's not like I'm just bringing newspaper in off the front porch and giving it to them. I grabbed a couple more, as well as a piece of larger chunk of bedding I found over in that pile of castings. But at this point, what's in that box is pretty much castings only. I know there's probably still babies in there. I know there's a few straggler bigger worms in there too. And, well, hauling over this much castings material wasn't really what I was banking on. But we took a little detour from the norm, and we we decided we'd experiment a little bit, so we did sort of rebrand how that previous bin was running as being sort of a mini wedge experiment, at least for a little while, so that we can write off the whole concept of the migration. Taking as much time as it did, it just didn't seem like a migration anymore because so many worms were just refusing to migrate. So I think I took away at least a good lesson from that, which says, you know, if you really want to see your worms, you know, move out of stuff, one of the key things is to allow the material to dry off, because if stuff is really damp, it just isn't going to happen. But it was really nice to see how all that casting material now crumbles into a really fine consistency. I'll bring it back over here so we can take a closer look at it. I've spread it out over here. You saw that I picked out a couple of the bigger worms. I found a piece of bedding that I extracted. I'm not going to go picking through this thing. And I'm still anticipating the fact that there might even be some cocoons in here that still need time. So I'm in no hurry. We'll get this done at some point in the future. Perhaps the only thing I'll do is move these little guys over into a somewhat smaller container. But we're almost done here. I just have one final, fairly important order of business that we need to take care of. So let me set the stage for that, and we'll be finished. Okay. As you all know, it's only official after we affix the new label and commission the system as one of my worm composting systems. So please join me in welcoming my original worms into their new home after being cooped up in a fairly old system for quite a long time. So I think they're going to enjoy what's going on here. I've got some coverings that I fashioned for this. I found this piece of paper bag that I had at some point, I think crafted for some other application, but didn't end up using it, so it was just sitting around, and then a piece of bubble wrap. So there it is, my newest worm bin. And I've also got the got these leftover coverings here from the previous bin, which, you know, I guess at this point isn't just turning into a store of castings. We're gonna have to keep that covered. Oops, and it looks like we also picked up some junk out of the other bin when we were pouring over. But I wanted to, there we go. I just wanted to get at least some sort of a basic covering onto this stuff, because while we do need it to dry, since the other objective here is to allow a little bit more time for, you know, babies to possibly hatch. I don't know, it seems like a never-ending cycle if you don't sort of put a stop to it intentionally. So I'll let this go for a little while, but I don't think it's going to be for long. So we'll do a baiting attempt on this in a little while. Try to get the babies out of here, but for now it's just a matter of trying to get a little bit drier. Maybe leaving only the middle covered this way to, you know, try to preserve a little bit of the moisture so that, you know, any babies that are still yet to hatch from their cocoons can do so, because I think cocoons need moisture for that process to occur. So I think we're almost done here. I've got a few things I need to put away and get cleaned up, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's all boring. Before I go though, really quick, let me say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.